Good evening, afternoon, or morning, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to today's SCI-Arc graduate thesis format lecture series. I'm John Cooper, faculty in History and Theory at SCI-Arc, and co-coordinator with Christy Ballier of Graduate Thesis. And it's my pleasure to welcome Aimi Hamraie and Kelly Fritsch to lecture jointly on the subject of Crip techno-science, disability culture as design. I'd also like to welcome and thank Shelley, who was signing this lecture. Kelly Fritsch is a critical disability studies scholar and Crip theorist. She is director of the Disability Justice and Crip Culture Collaboratory, a research lab bringing together disabled scholars, artists, designers, and activists working at the convergence of Crip and disability arts, techno-science, design, access, and justice at Carleton University. Aimi Hamraie is Associate Professor of Medicine, Health and Society and American Studies at Vanderbilt University and Director of the Critical Design Lab, trained in feminist scholarship, whose interdisciplinary research spans critical disability studies, science and technology studies, critical design and urbanism, critical race theory, and the environmental humanities. Kelly and Aimi, we're very glad to welcome you to this space today. In your radical collaborative 2019 Crip Technoscience manifesto, you outline a non-compliant, anti-assimilationist position for disability as a desirable part of the world that creates productive frictions and potential for resistance to intersectional power and privilege through techno-scientific practices of hacking and tinkering. In my opinion, your work is so powerful for providing a Crip techno-scientific language to reframe the world. And like any great manifesto, it's also driven by direct action, particularly in practices of critical mapping and hacking the regulatory codes of the built environment. But I also think it has much further to go to be realized and speculated with architecturally. And this is why I think it's so exciting for it to be shared in the context of SCI-Arc. I'm only regretful that we're not meeting together in SCI-Arc's building in Los Angeles, in the middle of the design studios, strewn with the evidence of the creativity and critical thinking of the thesis students, or able to visit their individual workspaces now distributed across the city and the planet. In their work, I think one might see the potential for what you call the world building and world dismantling power of design to take shape architecturally. And so I hope hearing about your work is a spur for all thesis students to reimagine their projects in these new ways towards new accessible futures. So with that, Aimi and Kelly, welcome to SCI-Arc, and over to you.
Hello, thank you so much for having us here. And I want to give a big thanks to Elena Manfredini and John Cooper for inviting us. My name is Aimi Hamraie. I use they, them pronouns. I'm going to describe what you would see on my screen for accessibility. So I am an olive-skinned Iranian, transmasculine, disabled person. I have short, dark, curly hair and rectangular glasses. I'm in a yellow room, and in the background, you can see like a work apron hanging on the wall and a dry erase board and some art. I live and work on the ancestral homelands of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Shawnee, and Muskogee Creek nations.
And I'm Kelly Fritsch. I'm a white disabled settler speaking from unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. I'm wearing she, her pronouns. In our talk today, we'll be sharing with you our collaborative work on Crip technoscience, disability culture as design. Crip technoscience names historic and contemporary practices of anti-assimilationist disability making and knowing. These practices have robust, complex, and unexpected intellectual genealogies, ranging from histories of disability activism and assistive device making to environmental justice, critiques of the cyborg, and Black feminist health activism. We'll be sharing some of the main ideas from our 2019 Crip Technoscience Manifesto and offer some examples of disability culture shaping design, as well as engaging some emergent Crip Technoscience and disability culture as design practices. One longtime practice of disability culture is giving a visual description when we present, whether that's online or in person, such as how we introduced ourselves to you. It's a practice that also includes describing the visuals on our slides. So on the screen, the slide reads Crip Technoscience, Disability Culture as Design, along with our names, and an image showing a white art gallery wall with an LCD screen mounted on it with scrolling text from the Crip Technoscience Manifesto, and a shelf with a white booklet and white gloves below it. Written on the wall of the gallery that was taken in New York City earlier in the spring of this year, when a text and audio-based description or installation of the manifesto was part of the EFA project space exhibition, Move Semantics Rules of Unfolding, facilitated by L.A. Moss and Jeff Casper.
Kelly and I started collaborating around 2015 as I was developing a Crip Technoscience analytic for my book, which is called Building Access. The cover of my book is shown on this slide, and it's basically like a black and white cover with a blue overlay, and the background shows images from the architectural graphics standards. These are line drawings of wheelchair users extending their arms into space with dimensional notations attached to them. And so I was thinking about Crip Technoscience for a chapter in this book, and then Kelly and I did some talks and events over the years together, which led us to co-edit a special issue of the journal Catalyst on Crip Technoscience. And we're also showing the cover of that special issue here. It's where the manifesto appears. And so there's an image here of an invention by John Farnworth. And the image shows the push handles of a manual wheelchair that have been covered in a kind of punk aesthetic metal spike, emphasizing the position of this wheelchair user who does not want to be pushed around by other people.
So Crip Technoscience braids together Crip, the non-compliant anti-assimilationist position that disability is a desirable part of the world, and technoscience, the co-production of science, technology, and political life. We are drawing here on Crip theory, a branch of critical disability studies that focuses on rejecting ableist norms and forms of assimilation. As disabled people engaged in disability community, activism, and scholarship, our collective experiences and histories have taught us that we are effective agents of world building and world dismantling toward more socially just relations. The grounds for world remaking, however, are frictioned. Technologies, architectures, and infrastructures are often designed and implemented without committing to disability as a difference that matters. And so we call attention to the powerful, messy, non-innocent, contradictory, and nevertheless crucial work of Crip Technoscience, the practices of critique, alteration, and reinvention of our material world. In naming Crip Technoscience, we invoke long histories of feminist, queer, anti-racist, and disability collaborative praxis, such as in technoscience projects engaging universal design, sensory engineering, reproductive justice, and HIV/AIDS activism. Crip Technoscience is a critical engagement with the concept of technoscience, particularly as it is used in feminist science and technology studies to mean the non-innocent entanglement of scientific knowing and technological making, highlighting disabled people's own ongoing, creative, and open-ended appropriations of science, technology, design, and medicine. Disabled people frequently confront barriers between our bodies and built environments, and Crip Technoscience calls forth the skills, wisdom, resources, and hacks disabled people utilize for navigating and altering inaccessible worlds. Crip Technoscience contrasts with typical notions of assistive technology in fields like engineering. In those fields, design usually happens for rather than by disabled people. It is also usually meant to be a fix or corrective. This means that design is not often understood as political. Tech companies might host disability hackathons where they bring in disabled users to provide expertise, but the actual designing is usually up to non-disabled people who they think are making charitable contributions. This is often condescending and also ignores that disabled people do a lot of designing ourselves. We're always hacking, tinkering with, and redesigning our environments. And we do this not just because it creates more functional technologies or spaces for us, but also because design is political. In contrast to dominant forms of knowing and making for disability, we invoke Crip Technoscience to describe politicized practices of non-compliant knowing and making, world building and world dismantling practices by and with disabled people and communities that respond to intersectional systems of power, privilege, and oppression by working within and around them.
Technoscience focuses on disability culture and interdependence as a political technology. Disability culture is a term that we use in disability communities to describe all of the practices, ways of relating, and technological tools that emerge when disabled people get together, whether in person or in digital spaces. Disability culture is about disability as a generative source of design expertise, about making art, and about practicing good, close relationships. A lot of disability technoscience focuses on making disabled people more independent. This is helpful and useful, but there's also value in interdependence. When disabled people engage in design, we're often connecting with and drawing on one another's knowledge and skills to create new arrangements. We define interdependence as a political technology in reference to scholarship in the philosophy of technology about what forms of democratic participation emerge when marginalized people engage in design processes to meet their own and community needs. Interdependence is a Crip political technology because disabled people leverage mutual aid, skill sharing, and knowledge about how to hack or redesign spaces and tools to actually build what we're calling disability culture. We find interdependence as a political technology throughout the history of disability activism. The slide here shows an image, or a series of images, newspapers and political posters for an event that took place in 1977. And this is a kind of quintessential North American disability activist history. Disability activists in Berkeley, California, occupied the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to protest for the enforcement of Section 504 of the Federal Rehabilitation Act. This was a law that mandated accessible programs and spaces in federally funded buildings. So at the center of this slide, there's a handmade sign that says, "Sign 504 now," and the O is a wheelchair access symbol. There's also a protest flyer calling people to participate. There is the front page of the Black Panther newspaper with the headline, "Handicapped Win Demands End HEW Occupation." And then on the right are images of the protesters themselves occupying offices and participating in meetings. And they include a number of people seated in wheelchairs or standing. Activists in the independent living movement were trying to create a cross-disability consciousness which meant across mobility, disability, blind, and deaf people. And at the protest, they transformed this consciousness into a political technology by actually engaging in acts of design as protest. For example, when the police cut off the phone lines, deaf people used ASL to communicate from the windows to the outside, sending and receiving updates. When someone needed a refrigerator or food for medicine, another person rigged one using a bathtub and a fan. Disabled activist and designer Corbett O'Toole was one of the protesters, and she argues that disabled people's knowledge of how to already make these adaptations helped make the protest more successful. Interdependence is a central component of our interventions in the Critical Design Lab, which is a multi-institution disabled art and design collaborative that I direct. The lab is comprised of 10 disabled countries and multiple time zones. So we run everything remotely and through technological mediation. Building on these experiences and other design experimentation we've been doing with various technologies of remote participation, and kind of how these are central to disability culture, we devised the project shown here, the Remote Access Crip Nightlife Gathering, a kind of online dance party and social space that we hold on Zoom, and we poster with the text "Remote Access, a Crip Nightlife Gathering" in yellow against a black and white background. And the image on the right is a screenshot from one of our parties where the disabled artist Yo-Yo Lin was showing some of her art. And the art appears here. There's like a still of a video. It's kind of a blue-purple blob against a black background. And then at the bottom, there's a pop-up of the chat where someone is asking if anyone else is having trouble with the sound. So this project uses interdependence as a methodology for exploring disability culture. Kevin Gotkin, who goes by DJ Who Girl, is a member of the lab and has been doing research on history, nightlife, and cultural spaces. Simultaneously, I've been working on remote access methodologies in activist contexts since being in the Occupy movement, when I was working with local activists in Atlanta to develop protocols for live streaming general assemblies and negotiation processes. And other people in the lab also work on topics like image description and audio description. And so we combined all of these into the design of a party and created party protocols that other people could use to explore these methods. And so basically what happens here is if usually when you go to a party, you just eat chips in the corner by yourself, when you come to this party, the activity is actually producing access together in real time. So everyone's doing image descriptions together in the chat. There are people doing audio image description on a separate line. There's ASL, there's transcription. People are offering art, they're showing disability art. And so it actually becomes a kind of disability cultural space and is part of a whole world of virtual, digital, and remote access that is really central to disability design.
So Crip Technoscience centers the work of disabled people as knowers and makers and calls for greater acknowledgement of the lived experiences and material design practices of disabled people in the work of technoscientific intervention. This is because Crips are not merely formed or acted on by the world. We are engaged agents of remaking. People make access in our everyday lives in ways that do not get recognized as design, but the lived experience of disability and the shared experience of disability community create specific expertise and knowledge that informs technoscientific practices like the ones that Amy was just talking about. So one example that we give in the manifesto draws on work by historian Bess Williamson, who traced the ways that disabled people in the American post-war period documented their work as tinkerers in community periodicals, retrospective memoirs, and in oral histories. So on the slide, there are some images taken from the Toomey Gazette, a publication created by people with polio-related disabilities who, through this publication, shared their hacks to create access for themselves in the 1950s and 60s. The slide shows a black and white photograph of a person sitting in a bed using a mouth stick to operate a typewriter, and another person using an audio communication device while lying down. There is also a hand drawing taken from the Toomey Gazette showing various devices people created, such as a book holder and a board to transfer from a wheelchair to a toilet seat. These adaptations are often created by repurposing everyday household tools. Disabled people turned away from medical supply companies and toward hardware stores to alter objects to their own advantage and to stay out of congregate care institutions. Such tinkering complicates the typical association of the disabled cyborg with a desire for innovation, instead turning to maintenance practices as sites for examining the frictions, limitations, and failures inherent to techno-scientific design processes. Designer Sarah Hendren and anthropologist Katrin Lynch's project, Engineering at Home, has called attention to the ad hoc design practices of Cindy, a disabled woman with several amputations. While Cindy was able to access the best available rehabilitation technology that money could buy, she nevertheless found that these technologies were not very helpful, opting instead to develop her own daily tools. So the slide features some of these inventions, including an adhesive plastic hook to open jars, adaptive scissors and blades, a button and zipper puller, cable ties for opening drawer pulls and zipper pulls, a tool for getting out of the car, carabiners to make carrying bags easier, a card holder, purses with clasps rather than zippers, sponges to alleviate the discomfort where her prosthetic leg rests against her residual leg, a fork holder, 3D printed gloves, a washcloth that clips onto her hand, a clip attached to deodorant to make it easier to apply, a cup for scooping laundry detergent, an adapter for turning on and off light switches. We emphasize design with and by disabled people because it matters for how we can be together. Take this example from Ryerson University in Toronto, which won an architectural award for the design of the new student center. In the video, we will see what happens when a blind user attempts to access this award-winning building.
Stairs. I walk right into it. When I finally find the handrail on the right side of this bizarre column, it doesn't lead me up the stairs to the landing. Instead, it loops me past the top of the column and back down the adjacent stairs. There are stairs with angled railings outside the building going up to the front door. The main lobby staircase goes up 2 floors. Railings divided into 4 parallel sets of stairs. The right handrail is skewed to the left, cutting in front of a person as they walk up the stairs. The left handrail is at a skewed angle too. If you hold the railing like I did, your feet are guided in the wrong direction. This is a tripping hazard for blind people and for those with balance issues. Staircase railing should never be angled. Designers may think it looks cool, but it creates safety and accessibility problems. On the 6th floor is a room called the beach area for students to hang out and study. Stairs go from the front of the room up to the back of the room. There's a landing between each short flight of stairs. The stairs don't follow a straight path from the front of the room to the back. Speeding up the video, see how lost I get. Ramps. Here's an outside ramp to get from the street level to the building's front entrance 1 floor up. ramp's route is quite a maze. Normally, ramps follow a simple pattern, a straight line or switchback. That outdoor ramp has no railing. People with balance issues need a railing. I need one to follow a maze-like ramp. Angled pillars. Nothing should ever protrude at any height into a path of travel. No pillars should ever lean at an angle. When I go up the outdoor ramp from street level to the front door, there's a leaning pillar on my left side. My shoulder brushes right up against it. When I take that exterior elevator to the ground floor and walk outside, there's a leaning pillar in my path. I hit my head right near my right ear. It's troubling that this building won architectural awards. Here's a webpage announcing that it received the Canadian Architect 2011 Award of Excellence. Accessibility deserves greater priority.
I can see a lot of people in the audience shaking their heads at this. We're going to come back to stairs later. Access as friction. Emerging out of historical fights for disability rights, the terms accessibility and access are usually taken to mean disabled inclusion and assimilation into normative, able-bodied relations and built environments. When viewed as synonymous with inclusion, access and accessibility are treated as self-evident goods. However, the etymology of the word access reveals two frictional meanings, which Kelly has explored in her scholarship. First, enabling contact, and second, access as a kind of attack. Taking access as a kind of attack reveals access making as a site of political friction and contestation. While historically central to the fights for disability access, Crip Technoscience is nevertheless committed to pushing beyond these liberal and assimilation-based approaches to accessibility, which emphasize inclusion in mainstream society. And instead, we want to pursue access as friction, particularly paying attention to access making. Before enforceable disability rights laws in the US, disabled people took direct action to create ramps and curb cuts, making obvious the inaccessibility of the built environment. Disability activists, for example, took sledgehammers to sidewalks, using bags of cement to pour curb cuts. Dislodged from a sidewalk by a sledgehammer during a protest. It's in the permanent collection at the Smithsonian. And on the right is an image of a wheelchair user going in the street against traffic, and they're labeled as a non-conforming user. The disability rights movement used different kinds of material experimentation to enact Crip Technoscience. While the movement was critical of the field of rehabilitation, it didn't refuse the language or tools of rehabilitation outright. So it used the term independent living to promote a disability politics and are captured in a book by Ray Lifshay and Barbara Winslow called Designed for Independent Living. The book reveals that the everyday technological hacks that disabled people in Berkeley were doing in the 60s and 70s were enabling them to thrive in an inaccessible city. And emblematic of the movement's Crip Technoscience ethos, the authors offer the concept of non-compliant users. On this slide of a wheelchair user wheeling against traffic on a street without curb cuts. This technology-enabled movement against the flow of traffic marks anti-assimilationist Crip mobility, not an attempt to integrate, as in kind of liberal approaches to disability rights, but to use technology as a friction against an inaccessible environment.
In another example of access as friction, Colin Kennedy, who appears on the slide, is a cancer patient in Winnipeg, Manitoba, who protested hospital parking prices by filling the pay slot on a parking meter with spray foam, telling the local news that he planned to continue doing so until quote unquote changes were made. When Crip time came into friction with the hospital's parking meter time, Kennedy challenged health capitalism. Kennedy's activism, the use of spray foam to obstruct the parking meter, creates frictional access through attacking a technology of capitalist time and contests the commercialization of healthcare. Crip technoscience also plays with the boundaries of trust, interdependence, and Crip relations. Blind artist Carmen Papalia, for example, stages Crip uses of technology in public space. In one practice shown in the photograph on the slide, Papalia uses a 20-foot white cane on a busy street to create a sense of antagonism with other pedestrians, which renders access as a friction practice. In another, called Blind Field Shuttle, also pictured on the slide, Papalia leads groups of sighted people on walks with their eyes closed. Both practices make use of a technology, Papalia's white cane, to stage social interactions in public space that put ideas of independence into question.
So here I'm showing another project from the Critical Design Lab that focuses on accessibility in physical spaces. This project uses methods of participatory access making as the basis for what we might think of as techno-scientific access intimacy, or building relationships with people around creating access. So far, most of the examples that we've talked about have been more technological in the sense of kind of like tools and objects. But we also are thinking about architecture as a form of technoscience, because architecture also comprises a set of structures and tools that emerge from specific ways of thinking and knowing. And so it relates to issues of expertise and how knowledge shapes material forms. And there are many forms of technoscience surrounding the use of architectural and urban spaces as well, such as digital accessibility maps. So this project is called Mapping Access. And here on the slide, I'm showing a poster from these events that we hold called mapathons. And the poster has a kind of like map dot on it with a gold star. And then there's a photo of 3 people in a space, and they're looking at a survey and using a tool to measure the space. And so this project is based on creating accessibility maps that are a little bit different than the standard maps, which usually just have very quantitative data for a narrow range of access needs. And this makes the data appear very objective when in each with different knowledge of what it takes to make something accessible or not. And so we developed an alternative method called critical crowdsourcing. Rather than just creating functional maps, this project focuses on mapping as a tool for producing more critical relations between bodies, environments, and technologies. At mapathon events, both disabled and non-disabled people collect data. In the process, also interrogate the messiness of access making in institutional conditions and describe these collectively. And so they collect large amounts of data, but they also find things that are unexpected or that are against the institutional narrative about what forms of accessibility exist. And so they develop a critical framework in the process of observing the built environment. And so I'm going to come back to some of the results of this project later, but here just to say that the very process of engaging in this kind of critical participatory map making is also a form of Crip technoscience.
A couple of the examples of access as friction that we discuss in the manifesto are also taken up in my recently released disability culture children's book entitled We Move Together, which was written and illustrated with Anne McGuire and Eduardo Trejos. The cover of the book is on the screen, and it shows 5 pairs of legs against a bright orange background. On the far left, a golden-colored dog is seated on the ground wearing a working dog harness. Standing next to the dog is a woman with warm brown skin, wearing a turquoise skirt and red high-heeled shoes that match her red cane. At the center of the cover is a child with dark brown skin standing hand on hip, wearing brightly colored bracelets, blue shorts, a pink shirt, and blue sneakers with yellow laces. To the right is a white-skinned child standing with legs crossed, wearing pink and purple striped pants and blue and white sneakers. On the far right, a child with golden brown skin is seated in a blue power wheelchair, wearing a green shirt, yellow shorts, knee-high orange socks, and red and white sneakers. In one part of the book, a family is prevented from going for ice cream because there's a stair to get in. The text reads, "Sometimes when we're together, we get stopped in our tracks, like when all the fun and flavors of ice cream are just one step out of reach." In the image, a cat sits on the front stoop outside of an ice cream shop, licking its paw. Inside the shop, someone is picking out their ice cream with the shop clerk, while outside, 2 people are seated on a bench, enjoying their delicious ice cream cones. The single step at the shop entrance is a barrier for the woman using an electric scooter who wants to go inside for ice cream. She's joined by her family, who look disappointed and angry about this barrier. On the next page, it reads, "We notice when things are unfair, and it helps us get creative. We make plans, we solve problems." And the image shows the family from the ice cream shop busy at work together with friends and community members in a large yellow workroom. They are designing and building ramps that will make sure everyone can enjoy the ice cream shop and other public spaces in their community. The woman using the power scooter has a clipboard and is overseeing the work. A few kids gather around a man in a power wheelchair who is drawing out building plans for the new ice cream shop ramp. Some people are cutting wood using saws, glue, and drills. Others are painting the ramps bright colors. One kid is painting a picture on the wall. The cat lies on a red carpet with a child playing with a Rubik's Cube. And then on the third spread, the text reads, "We build something better." And the image shows the ice cream shop with its new community-built ramp that makes it possible for the mobility scooter user and her family to get ice cream. In fact, new ramps can be seen outside many of the cafes and shops along the crowded city street. The street is filled with activity, cycling, rolling down a ramp while another runs along the sidewalk. Parents push their baby in a stroller. Someone is delivering boxes using a trolley. A man using a white cane crosses the street at an intersection, and our friend the cat sneaks out of the fish store with a tasty treat. So these 3 spreads in the book refer to the Crip Technoscience project sparked by Toronto resident Luke Anderson's Access Project Stopgap. Anderson is pictured on the slide sitting in an electric wheelchair while holding onto a big red wooden ramp that is angled upwards. Trained as a structural engineer, Anderson first designed a simple portable wooden ramp in 2011, stenciled with the URL stopgap.ca, and gifted 13 of these ramps to businesses in his neighborhood. Built as a temporary stopgap measure to improve accessibility, these ramps are a non-compliant technology. They are not intended to be permanent, and they do not have to follow building codes, and they do not need a building permit or a variance, all of which can be expensive and difficult to obtain. Anderson's experiment took off, leading to the formation of the Stopgap Foundation and the Community Ramp Project, which has now distributed over 2,000 ramps worldwide. Another one of these 2,000 ramps is on the slide, showing an image of a blonde manual wheelchair user going up a bright blue ramp into a coffee shop. As part of creating the kids' book, my co-authors and I also created an open source learning guide that is available for download on our website at wemovetogether.ca. The learning guide is for use by educators, community groups, and book readers. Some of the activities are shown on the slide, including designing a ramp or imagining building a welcoming city. Other activities include a community accessibility checklist for noticing the things that make our cities more accessible, like public benches, curb cuts, tactile pavement, ramps, push buttons for opening doors, walk signal noises at intersections, street lighting, public transit, and so on. This book draws on disability culture and disabled knowing and making, and seeks to impart to readers how both small and big interventions in our built environments can improve access. So there's another activity that asks book users to think about how they define access and what it means. Disabled people want social change, which means engaging with the lived knowledge of disabled people, but it also requires non-disabled people to develop anti-ableist practices and commit to disability justice.
Crip Technoscience is committed to disability justice, a concept that comes from the Sins Invalid Collective. The stylized image here has text in different typefaces against a light pink and red swirly background. The text lists the disability justice principles: intersectionality, leadership of the most impacted, anti-capitalism, cross-movement organizing, wholeness, sustainability, cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. Disability justice is a movement led by disabled people of color and specifically by collectives who draw on art and design to do political advocacy. And so disability justice isn't just a theory, it also has a significant focus on material manifestations of political values, in addition to creating a new theoretical framework. Similarly, design justice, a concept that comes from Sasha Costanza-Chalk and is promoted by the Allied Media Project's Design Justice Network, is an emerging framework from within design discourse that challenges the charitable sensibilities of technology designed for users, and instead devises methods for prioritizing marginalized users. Crip Technoscience contributes toward a synthesis of these two frameworks, or what I've been thinking and writing about recently as disability design justice. And you can learn more about this in a podcast that the lab makes called Contra. By taking an anti-assimilationist and anti-normative position, Crip Technoscience allows us to locate the ways that disability technologies and design are often entangled with military-industrial forms of knowing and making. Both assistive technologies, such as those developed by the military and then for civilian use, and accessibility codes in the buildings that that like we have for buildings now, were developed based on research on disabled veterans, and so they're part of that military-industrial system. In my book, Building Access, I also explore how this has been highly racialized, and disability access historically was very much focused on white disabled people. So if we want to work toward disrupting whiteness, colonialism, and projects like military conquest, we can find methods in Crip Technoscience to work toward decolonization and racial justice. For example, we can draw a line of connection between different kinds of technologies that disabled people use to connect across long distances. In the early 20th century, Black and Indigenous disabled people resisted institutionalization by using letters, telegrams, and art sent back and forth with their families for remote connection. And similarly today, Black, disabled, and deaf people work in solidarity with Black, disabled and deaf incarcerated people through organizations like HEARD, HEARD, to use remote technologies that can bring awareness to the prison industrial complex and how it affects disabled people. So while recognizing the inequitable ways that many people come to disability, Crip Technoscience also claims disabled life as desirable life, as life worth living, and as a difference that matters. Building on disability justice, Crip Technoscience centers the transformative role of disabled people in both technoscientific and activist conditions to build and dismantle more just social relations. An example that I want to talk about is Shannon Finnegan's project, the Anti-Stairs Club Lounge. This started as a project in art galleries in New York City, where a comfortable lounge was provided in an inaccessible gallery, and people could use it if they agreed not to climb the stairs to go to the inaccessible parts of the gallery. And so on the bottom left of the slide, there's a photo of a lounge with some comfy chairs and kind of like bright, cheerful yellow room. And Finnegan expanded this project to a protest at the site of Thomas Heatherwick's building Vessel, which is comprised entirely of stairs. And so the Anti-Stairs Club Lounge protest, which is shown in a large image on the slide, shows a group of people, most of whom are wearing these orange hats that have an anti-stairs symbol on them. Some people are seated in wheelchairs, some people are standing. A bunch of people are holding these signs, protest signs that say Anti-Stairs Club Lounge on them. And then on the top left corner of the slide is a pledge that the activists asked people to sign that said, "As long as I live, I will not go up a single step of the vessel." And the reason why they were doing this was that this building was created in Hudson Yards in New York as a kind of like tourist Instagram selfie, a monument to the staircase. And it does have an elevator that goes to some floors, but most of the views are distributed across the staircase, and so there isn't equal access. And so this is also an example of a kind of disability justice protest, because they were simultaneously protesting the stairs, but also the gentrification that this neighborhood and all the construction for these like tech companies and stuff was creating, and the fact that they had chosen this monument to the stairs as this kind of like aesthetic icon of the whole development. The other thing that I want to address is kind of picking up on the theme of stairs. After the Mapping Access project, which I showed on an earlier slide, the university campus where I work kind of tried to like adopt that same project to do a campus-wide accessibility master plan. And a really interesting thing happened in that process, which was that a decision was made to actually have an accessibility master plan that would last 40 years, and a bunch of money would be dedicated to it, and the campus building code would be rewritten. And there were these historic buildings, which I'm showing on this slide, kind of like two older buildings that did not have elevators in them. There was nowhere to put an elevator. And so the architects and a task force that I was on came up with a decision to build a third building in between them that would be a circulation corridor. The third building is like in a more modern style. It has a big glass wall and kind of like visible steel on the outside. It's very bright and airy. And this was really widely upheld as an awesome solution because it went beyond the code. It was not just doing the bare minimum of what the ADA required, it was exceeding it by building a whole new building. And that the idea for the building was put forth, the architect went and worked on it. And then this was also like right as COVID was starting. And so I recently saw this building and it looks just like these renderings. What you see when you look at it from the outside is a staircase. The staircase goes to multiple floors between the two buildings. And in the rendering on the right, you'll be able to see that the exterior facade of the old buildings is like integrated into the staircase. However, there are multiple landings that have seating on them, and the elevator is in the back. And so even though this was supposed to be a building that exceeded the ADA code and was doing this like awesome disability-centered thing and came out of an accessibility master planning process, it didn't demonstrate disability design justice, because this, just like Heatherwick's vessel, ended up being a monument to the stairs. And the reason why it came out this way was that the building was trying to go for the Living Building Challenge standard. And so one way to get points toward that standard is to have stairs that promote exercise in the building, which is a value that is, once again, an ableist value that is built into the environment. And so it's highly paradoxical that this happened, but it also shows how necessary it is to really centralize a disability design justice framework when trying to go beyond the code, because that could really mean anything. And in this case, it didn't end up with a very equitable solution.
So Crip Technoscience spans historical and contemporary design practices, political activism, scholarly alliances, global systems, and microscale resistances. We call for Crip Technoscience practices that challenge the political economy of technology, particularly as it's ensnared with injustices perpetuated by imperatives to fix, cure, or eliminate disability. Crip Technoscience struggles for both the present and future, in which disability is anticipated and welcomed, and in which all disabled people thrive, regardless of their productivity. By endorsing accessible futures, we refuse to treat access as an issue of technical compliance or rehabilitation, as a simple technological fix or checklist. Instead, we define access as collective, messy, experimental, frictional, and generative. Accessible futures require our interdependence. So the image on the slide shows one final spread from We Move Together, and the text reads, "Whether we're by ourselves or surrounded by many, our small movements can turn into big movements. We celebrate, we make change." And in the image, there's a big gathering of people in the city, and many of the people are visibly disabled. Some people are dancing with their wheelchairs or with their crutches. Some are blowing bubbles and playing drums. 2 children hold a banner that reads, "We're in this together." A child using a walker and wearing a helmet has a blue sweater that says, "Black Lives Matter." Another child sits on the shoulders of an adult wearing a red shirt that says "Deaf Gain" and holds up a cell phone to show the person on the phone the crowd around them. Another child with crutches holds a sign that says "Nothing about us without us," while a kid with sound-canceling headphones holds up a sign that says "Access is love." A person wearing a t-shirt says "Water is life" and raises his fist in the air. Crip Technoscience centers technoscientific activism and critical design practices rooted in disability justice, collective access, and collective transformation toward more socially just disability relations. We call for activists, scholars, and makers to expand possible futures for disabled people. We find Crip knowing-making in the design and implementation of architectures, technologies, and infrastructure. We seek broad recognition for and engagement with the world-building and world-dismantling force of Crip Technoscience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly and Amy, for an extremely provocative talk and informative in so many ways. Students and faculty, I know some of you will need to get to your meetings, but if Amy and Kelly, you're happy to stay for a few minutes to discuss and take a question or two, we'll keep the call going. So anyone, please feel free to ask a question, or indeed write one in the chat, and we'll ask it for you.
Maybe I just wanted to say thank you, Amy and Kelly, for a very, very informative talk. And I was really struck by also something I've never experienced before, was hearing the images that you were showing described in words. I just think it was so powerful how also that, and seeing things like the gentleman who was trying to navigate the Ryerson University building, and just how that exposed like all of these areas that maybe from a design standpoint, really kind of blind spots in a way that we don't think about. And so I was wondering, maybe could you talk a little bit about what you think sort of are the maybe best practices for ways to, educate ourselves as faculty and our students in terms of shifting our perspective on some of these things that we overlook?
Thank you so much for that question. This is Amy speaking. I think that there are just starting to be so many resources for architects in particular that go beyond the ADA. And part of this is because there's a generation of people, disabled people now, who grew up kind of after the ADA and had access to architectural training. And so in previous generations, there were, maybe like 5 disabled architects or something like that. And now there are so many more. And there's also just like a lot more knowledge and practice from disabled people who are not architects that's being offered toward thinking differently about things. So there are like a whole bunch of accessibility mapping projects, for example, that really clarify how do we read the built environment? How do we think about that differently? And then also just the practice of having disabled people involved in design decisions is so important. And this is a practice that has existed for decades in terms of people being brought in as user experts, but really like leading those design decisions too, and like working with students directly, I think is extremely important. And there are, all sorts of disability design collaboratives and things like that are emerging now, some more in tech, but I think that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from them as well.
I also wanted to say thank you so much for your presentation. I'm really glad that I attended today's talk, and it was so inspiring and powerful to see examples like you showed with the university and how actually disabled people struggle to follow circulation in those buildings that were not thought through properly. And obviously, in architectural schools were taught to do ADA because it's so important, but it's not as. And I just like this. I wish you had even more lectures like this that show the problems that were presented so well, because after seeing these videos, you understand how important it is. You read articles, you read the codes and learn on them, but still without this visualization, you're not fully, at least for me, right? You're not, because I'm coming from a country where ADA is now widely spread as it should be. I'm coming from Russia. And unfortunately, majority of buildings are not properly designed for disabled people to properly circulate there and just use the facilities and buildings. And obviously here in America is much more spread. Yet I wish we can contribute even more into this field and make buildings and just any other spaces are much more accessible. And I'm just really glad that I saw your presentation, and that gave so much inspiration and just make me want to contribute much more in future. So thank you.
Thanks so much for your comment. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we talk about disability culture as a key component of this, because it really is about ways of being in the world that go beyond even what the ADA says you should do in design. And any kind of regulations are never going to capture the diversity of the ways in which humans and non-humans use space, right? And so one of the things we're really trying to express is that there has to be some flexibility and openness to the way design happens to anticipate all sorts of different kinds of uses of space that you may not encounter in your everyday lives. But if you provide the grounds by which people can come together, then you're suddenly going to see different kinds of people use space in ways that weren't anticipated.
Yeah, thank you very much for your lecture, Kelly and Amy. I too don't have so much of a question, but more of just a statement. And with all the students on here, we talk a lot about when we're designing buildings, we talk a lot about circulation as like in a sort of a general way, but more specifically, we often talk about designing different scenarios of how people move or how people use a building, like why they would enter the building, right? Are they this type of user? Are they that type of user? And I love adding to that conversation, like how do they use that building? Because it just offers so many more opportunities for spaces as well. And like of exchange and interchange and pause. And those places often maybe are second in terms of a design in place of like a signature stair or something, which I think your lecture really well pointed out. And so I just love to think how we start to talk about circulation on how people use buildings, and also where are those opportunities of interchange of many different speeds. I think that's also kind of an interesting thing. In architecture, there's so many opportunities when people are moving through buildings at different speeds, at different heights, and have moments to kind of pause and interchange. So it's more of a statement and just a thank you.
Hi, Kelly and Ami. So lovely to listen to the lecture. I also second Marcelin in the sense that the descriptions not only of the images, but also of your text that you're reading is actually quite lovely to hear. It seems to me that like in watching and listening, that there are multiple acts of leveling happening, both at the material and an institutional level. You mentioned those are often like ad hoc and made with materials found at hardware stores versus like medical supply companies. I wonder if there are other material changes or conditions you see developing at the architectural or building scale, or even at the world building scale, that aren't just at material thresholds.
Can I ask you to repeat the question part of your comment?
Yeah, I was just, if you were maybe pointing to thresholds that were often being fixed with like ad hoc or things that you might find at a hardware store, like the ramps or wedges that you were showing that solved kind of everyday problems. I was wondering if there were conditions you saw developing at architectural scales or even like world building scales that maybe implied different material conditions at various thresholds, not just the threshold of a door, maybe not the threshold of an expansion joint, which you see with various like softer materials. But if you were seeing those develop both like in the research that you're looking at, but elsewhere, I guess.
Yeah, that's such a good question. So something that comes to mind that's more of a metaphoric threshold than a physical one. So not an entryway, but we write about this in the manifesto a little bit. Since the 90s, there have been just like tons more people who have chemical sensitivities and like pretty serious environmental illnesses. And were not believed for a very long time, but more and more building professionals are the people who are giving like scientific validity to their experiences by building buildings with different materials. And that same standard that led to the stairs being built in that one building actually has a lot of really good stuff about reducing the thresholds for chemical exposures in buildings so that people are able to enter them and not experience off-gassing and stuff like that. And so there are standards for what percentage of the materials have to be recycled and that kind of thing. And I think of that as a disability justice issue, and it's also a climate justice issue. And it shows how those projects are compatible, because if we were to design the world as if everyone has intense chemical sensitivities, like we would choose entirely different materials than typically buildings would, but it would also like reduce climate emissions because of VOCs and stuff. And so that's not a thing that's like led so much by disability culture, so much as that like there's a point of alliance and convergence where people in disability culture previously were not even able to like go into a new building, for example, and now because of these sustainability standards are able to. And I hope that there will be more kind of exchanges and more like knowledge derived from lived experience that influences other building standards in the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting how you could kind of, well, I guess in some ways it's like the building project that you mentioned wasn't necessarily inscribing or like semantically working against the kind of codes that were maybe validating or unvalidating certain ways of moving through a space, but that you could do that the same way with material.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, Aimi and Kelly, thank you once again. I feel that I'm sure I speak on behalf of some of the other faculty here and students. I feel that these are kind of beginnings of conversations which I think are going to play out in reviews and kind of social conversations. I feel there's a lot for us to pick up on. So, as I mentioned before, I hope this is the first conversation and meeting that we have, and we hope that there'll be other opportunities to invite you back to the SCI-Arc context, and to see some student work. I think would be really amazing to engage these questions. So, thank you again, Shelley, and wishing everybody a good rest of the day.
Thanks so much, John.